So many videos have been made about this plugin. Really, I don't think I've ever seen that many YouTube videos made about a single plugin release ever. But still, I'm going to add one, and this is why I think you should keep watching. 1, I will not go over all the controls of the plugin like all the other reviews. 2, I will actually compare the sound to some other well-known and favorite reverb plugins. 3, I will tell you what's so fundamentally different about this plugin, which makes me like it so much. And 4, I will go into a very practical use case of shaping your reverb by means of the controls of this plugin. Because, of course, like you've seen already, I'm talking about Crystalline by Baby Audio. So let's go. So at the end of March 2022, I made a video on the best vocal reverbs, in which I compared a number of played reverbs on the vocal of my band The Wash, and asked the question whether you could actually hear the difference between all those different reverbs. If you haven't seen that video, I will link it in the description below. About a couple of weeks after I released that video, Baby Audio released Crystalline, a brand new reverb plugin. Now, reverb plugins do get released all the time, so this was nothing special, I thought. But after seeing a couple of reviews of this plugin, I got interested and decided to check it out myself. And I have to say that I liked it so much that I bought it immediately after trying it out. So in this video I'll show you why that was. Starting with the sound. If you look at this picture, you can see the results of my survey about which reverb in my previous video you liked most. And well, Seventh Heaven came out on top, then Relapse LX480, followed by the other ones. So let's have a listen to this reverb and compare it to some of the most popular ones from my previous video. So this is the same project as I used for my previous reverb comparison on the vocal. And again, all reverbs have been set to a plate with around 1.5 seconds of delay time and a pre-delay of 30 milliseconds to get a similar sound. Now I also added Crystalline to this one, and I set the decay time slightly longer because it seems to be that this is really the time that the reverb has completely died out for Crystalline, and for some of the other ones the reverb seemed to linger a bit longer. So to make it more comparable, I started with a Vox Plate Medium preset, set the pre-delay to 30 milliseconds, got a comparable decay, and I turned off the ducker here as well, because all the other plugins do not have a ducker. And I also turned off the shimmer to make it about as dark and bright as the other plugins. So let's have a listen and compare Crystalline to some of the favorites of the previous test.
We just drove 500 miles. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy. We just drove 500 miles. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It's crazy.
Now if you want to listen to these files in your own DAW, I'll provide a download link for all of them from the previous video, as well as the new one with the Baby Audio reverb in the description below. And at this point I also want to say that this video is definitely not sponsored. I bought this plugin with my own money, and Baby Audio did not ask me to make this video, and all of my opinions are my own. And if you like this video by now, it would be great if you could like it on YouTube, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the little bell icon so you know when I post another video. And if you want to support the channel even more, I have a lot of affiliate links in the description to the gear that I'm using in the studio over here. And if you buy anything in any of those stores after clicking my link, I will get a small commission without any extra cost to you. But let's now get back to what it's all about, the Crystalline plugin. Because one of the big changes in this plugin is really the philosophy of how you control it as a user, as an engineer. And I've promised that I wouldn't go over all the parameters, so I'm not going to do that. But I am going to show you how the situation used to be when you set up a reverb plugin, how it changed for the better, and how Crystalline even improved on that. For example, if we start by looking at one of the classic reverb plugins, the Lexicon Vintage Plate, looks good, still sounds very good as well. Even though by now I think it's about 10 years ago that this was released. It's still one of my reverb staples that I use on almost every mix. But when you look at the parameters, you see there's quite a lot of them. You have pre-delay, reverb time. Those are, usually the only two that I touch in this plugin. But you also have the reverb out frequency, diffusion, high cut, bass factor, tail width, early level, well, the mix, of course. And if you push the edit button, you see that there are even many more plugins. You have shape and spread additionally. In the reverb section, well, you have crossover frequencies, tap, slope, spin, wonder. In the reflection section, you have a couple extra as well. You have echo settings, echo delay, echo gain, echo feedback, and you even have an echoes 2 section with very similar parameters again. And this is really how it used to be also in the hardware versions of the Lexicon plugins. You have lots and lots of controls, but to actually use those controls, you really needed to be an expert. Now, this already improved with later plugins. For example, if we have a look at the FabFilter Pro R, it's still quite a technical looking interface due to the EQ curves, but on top you actually see knobs which have a less technical character. For example, there's a brightness knob, making the reverb either more dark or more bright. Character, making the reverb more clean or more chorusy. So this is more modulation related. You have a distance knob, making the effect of the reverb more like your subject is close by or further away. You have the space, indicated by some icons, where the largest space is a church. Yeah, decay rate, I guess that's still a technical parameter. Stereo width, mono or very spacious, and mix is also the usual parameter of how wet or dry you want the effect to be. But still, I think this is already quite an improvement compared to the parameters that you had in the Lexicon. And if we now look at Crystalline, it's even more user-friendly in that you have controls for the reflection, just size controls, how much sparkle do you want the sound to be wide or less wide, the depth of the reverb, including modulation, shimmer, resolution, whether you want the character to be pristine or maybe you want the character to be basic. You have controls for cleanup of the reverb, like do you want to dampen it at certain frequencies, whether you want to filter out for some frequencies from the sides. You have a gate with a release, and you have some tone related controls, emphasizing the highs or the lows, smoothing out the reverb, and the control to just accentuate the transients or maybe just the more sustained part of the sound. And I found all of these controls to make this reverb really very, very easy to use and really customize the sound to exactly what you would need for a certain track. And as an example of this, I'm going to show you how you can use these controls to shape the reverb on the snare sound. So in this project, you can see that I have a MIDI track for the snare, and Crystalline is on the audio output of the MIDI track, but it's currently disabled. And on the MIDI track, I have the modern 80s drum kit by Dom Segales, who is probably already very well known to you if you're a Cubase fan, and otherwise I will link his channel in the description. But let's listen to this dry snare sound. Yeah, so a very dry 80s snare sound really. Now the way you can shape the reverb for this sound I actually got from a clap example from Matthew Weiss's channel, which is also a great audio channel, which I'll also link in the description. Check it out and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber over there. But I'm just going to explain his technique in my own words here. Because if I now turn on Crystalline on the snare sound, and I'm using the basic plate preset. Yeah, just a nice reverb on the snare. Now what you can now do is that you can make the reverb fill the whole room between the consecutive snare hits. And you can do that very easily by using this end control in Crystalline over here, and you set it to sync. Because basically what you want it to do, you want it to sync to a whole note. Over here it will tell you what kind of note it is syncing to. So if I sync to a whole note, basically the reverb will last the whole measure until the next snare hit. Let's have a listen. Yeah, so that works, and you clearly hear it when the snare is playing just by itself now. But in a whole mix, the last part of that reverb may actually get lost in the other instruments. So what you can now also do is that you can increase the size of the reverb a bit and set this sync to 2 whole notes. So what now happens is that the reverb will basically last for 2 whole measures, but then after the second snare hit you will hear the reverb of both snare hits, which may also not be desirable. So what you can then do is clean up the tail of that reverb to still end at the end of the measure by using the gate. So I will try to gate the reverb so that it still stops at the end of the first measure, but because I've selected a larger size and I set the end for 2 measures, the reverb will be at a more constant high level at the end of the first measure. But I still want to stop it. Let's see if I can get that to work. Yeah, so now you could hear that it was actually stopping a bit too soon, and it stopped quite suddenly. So what I can now do with the release part of the gate, I can make it stop less instantly and die out a bit more slowly. And again, with the threshold, I'm going to try to get it right up until the end of the measure. Yeah, so that sounds about right. So now my reverb fills up the entire measure quite prominently and has a bit of a smoother decay at the end of the measure before the next snare hits and the reverb starts again. Now I have to say that this is not a standard reverb sound on the snare, of course, but it's more an example of how you can shape the reverb sound to do what you want it to do. You can also make it much shorter, of course. Take up half a measure, for example. Now so far we've been shaping the reverb at the end of the measure, but we can also do that at the beginning of the measure. And you can do that with this start control. If we set this one to sync as well, and we, for example, sync it to the 16th note, you get a more rhythmic start of the snare reverb. One 16th note after the actual snare hit. Now if that is a bit too much, you can also still go back to specifying the start, which is really the pre-delay in milliseconds. For example, I don't know, about 30 milliseconds could be quite a good value. Yeah, so now the reverb still has a bit of a build-up after the snare hit, but you notice it less and less. But the build-up is still quite sudden though. Now if you want to avoid that, you can also use the ducker to create a build-up of the reverb after the snare hit, because this ducker makes sure that the reverb is attenuated while the actual snare is sounding, and once the original snare sound dies below a certain level, the reverb is slowly increased, so you can also do some shaping of the beginning of the reverb with that. Let's have a listen. And I will first set it pretty extreme so you can clearly hear it, that the reverb starts way after the original snare hit. Yeah, so this is probably too obvious that it's quite late, but if I decrease the ducker level a bit, you will notice that the start of the reverb is more in line with the end of the snare hit and it's less obvious. So now you can hear that the reverb is rising more quickly after the initial snare hit as well. But by using the ducker, you can hear that it eases in a bit more compared to just using the pre-delay. Now you can also use a combination of the two, of course. Anything is possible. Anyway, I thought this was a really nice example to show you how you can actually shape your reverb sound, the end and the beginning, by using the controls in Crystalline. Now another very nice thing to do with the reverb is to create blend and size in the mix. And I'll show you that in this video on a song of my band The Wash. So have a look at that, enjoy, and see you soon.